So we have in our next panel here, we're going to talk about social democracy in America and how the Democratic Party is representing that or not representing that. We have on Skype Lane Kenworthy, the author of Social Democratic America. And we have also with us here Joe Ryan, adjunct professor of political science at St. Francis College in Brooklyn. And later on we're going to have Eldon Klingen call in. Eldon is a member of Social Dems with a very long history, and he was a former New York City councilman back in the day. So at this point I'm going to turn it over to Patty, and Lane is on there for you.
Hello again. Actually, I want to ask, we want Lane, Mr. Kenworthy, to speak for himself and to give us an idea first about the book that he's written, which is Social Democracy in America, and then we'll ask him questions about his book. But more than anything, if you, Mr. Kenworthy, could just talk to us about what you see as a social democratic America and how you think we could get there soon. And I'm just opening up the floor to you if you want to talk about that.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, and by the way, thank you very much for coming. We're really excited to have you.
Sure, I'm very happy to do it. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to keep it brief, and I'm happy to try to answer questions. I'll just say a little bit about what I think of as social democracy and some of the stuff I've discovered as I research it, and then a little bit about the American context and politics. So I think of modern or contemporary social democracy as a pretty expansive and generous set of public insurance programs, commonly called the welfare state, but also including services like healthcare and education and more, coupled with a commitment to a high rate of employment. And this second element, I think, distinguishes contemporary social democracy from social democracy of 40 or maybe even 30 years ago, when it was often thought that we were well onto the road of fewer and fewer people in paid work and more leisure time. That debate, just as an aside, is beginning to resurface, I think. But modern social democracy takes, I think, tends to take it as given that you need a high rate of employment. There's a lot of evidence that this tends to be good for individuals, although nobody's in favor of forcing everyone into paid employment. But maybe more importantly, from a societal point of view, it turns out you need high employment in order to fund the kind of public insurance programs that are really at the heart of what social democracy tries to do. So I do a lot of research on institutions and policies that yield good societal outcomes. And I do a lot of comparison across the rich, long-standing democratic countries. So I compare the US with most of Western Europe, the Nordic countries, Japan, Australia, Canada, and so on. And I do some historical work as well. My conclusion from this work and from the growing amount of data that we have, which is a terrific thing, by the way, in terms of evidence, for our own experience and that of these other rich democratic nations, is that countries that put in place this set of institutions and policies, this social democratic model, or Nordic model as it's sometimes called, tend to do better on some of the really key goals that I think most of us ought to favor, including income security, a distribution of income or living standards that favors the least well off, that allows for a lot of economic growth, a high level of general prosperity, but tends to favor the least well off. And on equality of opportunity, although the cross-country data are a little more sketchy than I think we'd like. They also tend to do better on employment, which is both an outcome that we ought to want and a means to an end. They do just as well as other rich democratic nations on economic growth in the short run, the medium run, and the long run. And they do at least as well or better on a wide range of other outcomes that a lot of us care about, from happiness to health to safety to education to trust and more. So how do they do this? Well, in terms of achieving income security, that is to say, having a relatively small share of the population that suffers a big income drop from year to year or decade to decade. That's the most straightforward measure I think we have of income security, although there's a broader notion that lies behind this. Well, that's mainly a story of the welfare state or public insurance programs. Employment also helps, but there's a pretty strong correlation across countries and over time within countries between the expansiveness and generosity of public insurance programs and low insecurity or a high degree of income security. The same is true with respect to poverty, or as I called it earlier, a distribution of income and resources that prioritizes the least well off. You get that mainly through a generous and expansive set of public insurance programs. Again, a high employment rate can help, but the main story is the welfare state. Equality of opportunity, this seems to be most strongly associated with a set of programs that's employment conducive and also supportive to kids. And first and foremost here seems to be early education. I don't think we can have as much confidence in this conclusion as we can in the other two, but it looks more and more as evidence accumulates. And so equality of opportunity is a hard thing to measure, and it's especially hard to get data that are directly comparable across countries. But evidence has been accumulating over the last decade or so that increasingly, I think, suggests early education, healthcare, child allowance or child tax credit, if you want to do it that way, something that gets more income into the hands of families with kids, especially young kids, that these things are key to equality of opportunity, along with stuff that we've always known, improving neighborhoods, helping families in other ways, improving K through 12 education. So those are the stories on those three key outcomes that I think social democracy does particularly well on. For employment, the key seems to be a range of policies that are conducive to combining family and work, or balancing family and work, as we call it here. Again, early education is key, but paid parental leave seems to be very helpful. The big difference across countries in employment rates these days, and this has been true for the last generation, but it remains true today, is in employment rates of women. Mm-hmm. And here we did pretty well, meaning the United States, did pretty well in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s and 90s. But in the last decade and a half, we've really fallen off. So the employment rate among women has gone down. And that's partly a story of the Great Recession, which hit employment rates in all these countries pretty hard. But most of these other countries, or at least many of them, I should say, have done better than we have in the last decade and a half. And there's really strong reason to suspect that has to do with the presence or absence and the degree of generosity of these types of programs. So that seems to be a key. Another key is having modest rather than really strict regulations on labor markets and product markets. And here, this is kind of a familiar story that helps explain why employment rates are pretty low in countries like Italy and Spain and to some degree France. Regulations limiting the power of employers to do what they want can be helpful, but only up to a point. It seems to be better, at least in terms of promoting employment, to not go overboard in this respect. Okay, so that's a quick overview of that story. What are the implications for the United States? Well, I think it's really valuable to start with some historical perspective, because it's pretty easy and in some respects justified to be pessimistic about our potential for getting anywhere close to social democracy. But if you think about the United States in 2017, as not so great as we are in terms of having a generous and expansive set of public insurance programs and services and other policies that are conducive to a high employment rate, we're much closer to what I think are the world leaders here, countries like Denmark and Sweden and Norway, than we are to the United States a century ago. That is to say, we've moved a long way down the road toward a social democracy, even though we lag well behind these other countries. And so if we were to simply continue on the path that we've been on over the last century or so, which has been very much an episodic one, it hasn't been a smooth or steady path. It's been one of episodic advances, some retreats, but in truth, a very limited set of retreats. So I think of our movement over the last century as kind of a slow, episodic upward ratcheting on the road toward a social democracy. And if we're able to continue that, we're not gonna get anywhere near Denmark and Sweden in the next couple of years, or probably not even the next 10 years. But if you think in terms of 30 or better yet, 50 years, I think there's strong reason to expect that we'll get there. Why, despite the very formidable political obstacles that we face? Well, because even though these obstacles are real, we have a political system that makes it really hard to pass progressive legislation. We have all this separation of powers, and so it's pretty easy for opponents to block things. But every once in a while, circumstances are favorable, and stuff tends to get passed, and it's seldom taken away. Now, the mid-90s welfare reform is one exception to that. We may yet see big cutbacks to the Affordable Care Act occur in the next year and a half or so, or after that. These things are pretty hard to predict. But the general pattern over the last century has been for occasional advances in creating new programs or expanding existing programs, and very infrequent cutbacks, and almost never are programs like this taken away. So if we're able to continue that pattern, and I think there's good reason to think that we can, again, not in the next couple of years, so this makes me an optimist in the long run, not at all an optimist in the short run. I'll mention just one other thing here, and then on the politics, and then one other point about modern social democracy and its limits. So it's often said that you can't get a social democracy in a large country, or maybe you can't get it in a diverse country, or in a country where unions aren't particularly strong. Well, here again, I think you want to look at the historical record across the United States, but in contemporary terms, you might also benefit from looking at California. So California is not Denmark or Norway or Sweden, but in the last decade or so, California's managed to pass a bunch of things that progressives in the United States have wanted for the country for quite a long time, and that both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and very likely future Democratic candidates will be proposing. Things like a paid parental leave, a paid sickness program, a move to a $15 minimum wage. That'll happen over a series of years, but that's California's on the road to that. A supplemental defined contribution pension program for people who don't get it for their employers. Higher taxes on the richest Californians, with the money going to fund K through 12 education, and a variety of other smaller things. And there's now a serious discussion about adopting some sort of full funding of college education to make it much more affordable or possibly free for all California residents, as well as something like a single-payer healthcare program. Now, I don't know if either of those will get passed, but they're getting very serious considerations. California is a state with 40 million people, so it has more people than all of the Scandinavian countries put together, a larger population. It's a very diverse state. And unions here, although they tend to be a little bit stronger than in the United States as a whole, compared to unions in Denmark or Norway or Sweden, they're quite weak. And none of this is to suggest that California, as it has so often in the past, is going to show the way forward to the rest of the country. Again, these things are unpredictable, but it, I think, gives us reason to think that, again, in the context that we face in the United States, where the obstacles are pretty formidable, there nevertheless is some reason for optimism. Let me quickly mention two important things that I don't think this contemporary social democratic set of institutions and policies necessarily deals effectively with, but that are quite important, both economically but also societally and politically. So one is wage growth. A strong welfare state and a high employment rate don't automatically translate into wage growth. And as many of you probably know, here in the U.S., we've had nearly half a century now with effectively no increase in wages from the middle part of the wage distribution on down. The Nordic countries have fared much better, but that's because they have much stronger unions. Now, as much as I'd like it to be the case, I don't see any path whereby the United States gets to 60 or 70 or 80% unionization rate. Even at our peak, we were closer to about 35%, and I'd be stunned if we got anywhere close to getting back to there. So it's a real question how you get, or if you can get at all, wage growth in a social democracy that doesn't also have a very strong and relatively centralized union movement, which is something I don't think the United States can probably achieve. Now, I have some ideas about that, and others do too, but I mention it as one very important potential limitation of this model. Another is what you do about particular locations where employment disappears because the only remaining manufacturing firm closes up or downsizes. And this is an important, at least the data suggests, an important part of the political story in the United States, at least in the 2016 election, and likely, at least for the next few years and probably beyond. And I don't think the social democratic model necessarily has a good solution there. Once again, there are some ideas, but even Sweden and Denmark haven't, I don't think, figured out a great way to handle this particular problem. So I'm just going to mention those. I'd be happy to answer questions on anything I've said or left out, but I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought up the question about the trade union movement and whether or not or how it might grow, because as I read your book, it seems to me that you are arguing that if the government will take the measures to, if government would take measures to first develop legislation that protects workers and their rights, and then will also enforce that legislation, that there might not be a need for a labor movement, or at least a strong one. And in what you've been discussing right now, I seem to get a different sense from you. So could you take off on that?
Yeah, sure. It's not that I don't think a stronger labor movement or union movement would be beneficial. It's that I'm pretty pessimistic about the likelihood of a real significant advance in this area. And my pessimism stems not just from our own experience since the 1950s. We've had a pretty steady drop to now, as you surely know, we're in the neighborhood of 10% unionization rate and much lower than that in the private sector. So that's already suggests grounds for pessimism. But the bigger problem, I think, is that this same kind of thing is happening in all of the rich democratic countries, with just a few exceptions. The only countries where we haven't seen a slow but very steady and cumulative reduction in unionization rates over the last generation, and a few countries even longer, are 4 nations in which getting access to unemployment insurance hinges on union membership. That's a couple of the Nordic countries and Belgium. And for peculiar historical reasons, their unemployment insurance systems were set up in this way. Now, I suppose if we could change our laws so that that were true here, maybe that would yield a spurt in union membership. But everywhere else, from Germany to many other countries in Western Europe and beyond, we see declining unionization rates. Now, they started from higher levels, and so their levels are not quite as low as ours are now. But this suggests that it's something not just peculiar to the United States or our laws or practices, that there's something beyond this. And this makes me even more pessimistic. So I'm not at all suggesting that it wouldn't be a good thing, but I've been trying to think about what a society can do without depending on a strong or even moderate in strength labor movement.
And following up on that, I'd like to know, I mean, I can give chapter and verse and long dissertation as to why unionization has fallen off in the United States. But could you speak a little bit about how that's happened in Europe, and especially in the Scandinavian countries where you wouldn't really expect that to have occurred?
Well, we don't see it in the Scandinavian countries, but it's because of that peculiar institutional setup that I mentioned, that in order to be eligible for unemployment insurance, for unemployment compensation, you've got to pay union dues to become a union member, because unions together with an employer confederation administer the unemployment insurance system. It's not technically a government policy, although government helps organize it. But everywhere else, including in Germany, which has long been a very strong labor country, they never had a super high unionization rate, but it's fallen off quite dramatically. Now, there's a little bit in some of these countries, the so-called collective bargaining coverage rate, that is to say the share of employees whose wages are in a de facto way set by collective bargaining, remains a little higher, but it too has been falling in many places, and in Germany quite sharply. It's a variable story, but it seems to be quite a common trend. And part of it, I think, is the simple free rider problem that unions have always faced. Part of it has to do with cultural changes. Part of it has to do with the fact that in a number of these countries, there are legislatively mandated works councils, and so employees have representation on other matters apart from wages that's required by law, and that they get to elect and participate in. And so this may make them feel that unions are simply no longer as important. Partly it has to do with the shift to services and the change from mainly a male workforce to a much more diverse workforce, the same sort of trends that have been going on in the United States. But I think the simple answer is that there's no single cause of this development, but it is very much a near universal development. Again, in the rich democratic
do you
nations.
think that okay? Do you think that one of the causes, because I agree with you, there are probably very many, but do you think that one of them might be the fact that the EU has, having opened up to the Eastern European bloc, excuse me, sorry, anyway, that the migration or the immigration and migration of workers from the Eastern Bloc, and we just had a very fascinating conversation with politicians from Hungary and Bulgaria this morning. And one of the things that the Hungarian speaker was talking about was that people from Hungary are, as he put it, voting with their legs. In other words, they're leaving Hungary because wages are so low, and they can't keep up with the cost of living at all. And so those who can are migrating into Western Europe, especially Germany, to take jobs there. Do you think that migration has anything to do with this this problem?
I suspect that it contributes. So this increases diversity, of course, of the labor force, and it's quite possible that that it might reduce solidarity and thereby encourage some people to think, you know, I don't any longer want to be part of this. This being the union or the labor movement, but we've seen this downward trend in unionization rates go on for several decades, and the big push in migration is really begins about 10 or 15 years ago when these countries joined some of these countries anyway joined the EU. So while it's possible it has contributed, it's hard for me to believe that it's the main cause.
Okay, well, I was.
Question time yet?
No. Okay. Okay, and then I had one more thing I wanted to ask you because I'm from California. I actually live in a part of California that, as I put it, is the best kept secret in California, and we are not quite the Central Valley. We're just a little bit south of that, and we're a mountain community, and we live in the forest. So my situation is absolutely unique. But I grew up in Los Angeles, and spent many years in the labor movement there. And I have found to me, the most dramatic thing that has happened in California in terms of goals, democratic goals, and going towards social democracy, if you would, is two factors. One was that we were able to establish when they did the redistricting in 2010, there was a commission established to redraw congressional lines. So in other words, they pretty much did away with gerrymandering in California. And that was one. And then the other, it was the Republicans, and especially Pete Wilson, who was governor at the time, when they went for or supported excuse me, Proposition 187, which meant that undocumented immigrants could not receive services, social services of any kind. Their children could not go to school, literally couldn't go to California schools, and that if they did, teachers were supposed to turn them into immigration authorities. And at the time, Californians actually did vote for that referendum, but then it was annihilated by the courts. And so you have the Latino population of California will virtually never vote for a Republican under any circumstances. And thus, and the more that come into the state, the more that have been immigrating into the state since then, have basically the same disdain and horror about Republicans, and so they just won't vote for them. Do you see that as factors involved in this development in California towards more progressive policies?
Yeah, I think that's right. So California, even just 10 years ago, there were lots of people were suggesting that it was a basket case. It was difficult to pass anything because at that time they had a supermajority requirement just for doing the budget. There's still one for any kind of tax increase, which makes it very hard to pass anything legislatively unless one party has a supermajority in both houses and holds the governorship. That's now the case, although it's a sort of fragile fragile number above that supermajority requirement. But yes, the Republicans' stance on immigration ended up coming around to bite them. I don't know if that's going to be the case nationally, but the Republican Party nationally has very much moved in the direction that Pete Wilson was already at, and his colleagues a decade and a half ago, to the extent that Latino population across the country moves in the way that they have in California. If that happens, I think that's likely to help politically. It won't be enough because it's a much larger share of the population here in California than in most states around the country, but it could make a difference. And I suspect more generally, the way things are playing out in the Republican Party at least makes it possible that we may have a moment in the not too distant future. As I said earlier, I'm not especially optimistic about the near future, about much progressive advance in the near future and coming from the federal government. But the Republican Party has moved so far to the right and is so beholden to some of its extreme elements, and you combine that now with a very strange president who holds different views from many of the mainstream or at the far right end of his party, but is essentially going along with them in many respects. Anyway, it's hard to say how this will play out, but it's not inconceivable that the nation as a whole may react in the way that California did to Pete Wilson and that particular move by the Republican Party. Now, Democrats have other advantages in California. They've always been extremely strong in the north. Urban areas are a big part of the state, and they tend to be more liberal. So, I don't expect the United States as a whole to look like California 10 or even 20 years from now, but it's very much moving in that direction. So none of this guarantees anything, but I think it gives us some reason for medium-term optimism, despite very strong reason for immediate-term or short-term pessimism.
Earlier on, you made reference to the attempt to have some kind of improved equality of incomes. It seems to me the last major attempt made by the Democrats to improve this situation was with President Johnson's Great Society programs in the 1960s. Now, the Republicans, especially Ronald Reagan, responded to those policies by saying that there was a war on poverty and poverty won. Do the research materials that you've produced tend to show that actually there were improvements in the 1960s that did benefit the poor and that did reduce poverty, at least for a time?
Yeah, that's very much true. So the federal government has this poverty rate that is based on a formula created in the early 1960s. And if you look at that calculation, it dropped quite dramatically in the 1960s, but then in the mid-70s effectively stopped, and it's hovered between 11 and 15%. Since then, it goes up during recessions and down during periods of economic growth. But it's effectively been flat, and that seems to, in some respects, justify the Reagan-type conclusion, although even that conclusion ignores what happened in the 1960s. But that poverty rate's a bit misleading. A better measure would suggest that living standards, even just if you think about them narrowly in terms of incomes, but certainly living standards for those at the low end in the United States have increased. They increased pretty steadily, rapidly in the 1960s, pretty slowly, but nonetheless fairly steadily since then. The real problem isn't that we haven't had improvement, it's that we haven't had nearly enough improvement. So it's unfortunately, in terms of politics, it's a more nuanced story. But that, I think, is the most accurate interpretation of the data. And we can say with a great deal of confidence that many of the government programs that provide money, whether it's welfare or disability programs or food stamps or the earned income tax credit, have played a key part in that.
Back in the 1960s, one of the things that inspired the war on poverty was the socialist writer Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, in which he talked about a culture of poverty. How has the view of academics changed since the 1960s about why people are poor and how to solve the problem of poverty today?
Well, those are two different and related but separable questions. So, what causes the problem of poverty and what the solutions are, or how do you reduce it? I mean, one could follow automatically from the other, but they don't necessarily. So, I think we know now. Well, first of all, there are two different questions about causes of poverty. So, one question is, how do we explain, or what causes some people to be poor and others not? And then a second question is, what determines the overall poverty rate for the country as a whole? And those are separable questions as well. And so if you think about a culture of poverty or family circumstances, neighborhood circumstances, lack of education, various personal deficiencies, all of those things may contribute to explaining discriminations, another one, all of those things may contribute to explaining why one person's poor and another is not. And that's interesting and important to spend time on, but it's a separate question how many people or what share of the population is poor overall. And there I think we've made a fair amount of progress, we meaning social scientists. And unfortunately here again, we increasingly know that the story is complex. So economic trends have mattered a great deal. The fact that it's much more difficult now for people with limited education to find a decent paying job, that's largely a story of shrinkage of manufacturing. But not only that, it's also a story of union weakening, of globalization, of automation, of a change in corporate culture toward the shareholder value orientation, maybe a little bit immigration, although there's a lot of debate about that. So all of these things have contributed to making it more difficult for people with limited labor market skills to get enough income, high enough wages, and/or enough employment hours to get themselves or their household above the poverty line. So economic and societal trends have been difficult or challenging, or they've made the struggle tougher over the last generation, especially since the mid to late 1970s. Government programs have done more, but they haven't, the degree to which they've increased or expanded hasn't been sharp enough or significant enough. So if we really want government to make a big difference to help pull people above the poverty line or get them to whatever level of income or living standards we think is decent, we need it to do more in a whole host of ways. You know, we need a more generous earned income tax credit, especially for people who don't have kids. We need probably a higher minimum wage. We need a higher child allowance. We need an unemployment insurance system that's easier to access and maybe provides a little more. We probably could use a wage insurance system that would pay people who end up taking a lower paying job, part of the difference between their former wage or salary and the one that they're now earning. We need paid sickness leave for everybody, not just people who work in large and more generous companies. So I guess that maybe goes part of the way to answering the second question about what the solutions are. In terms of the labor market end, I think a higher minimum wage and sure, stronger unions would help. But as I said, I don't think we've figured out an effective way to do that. Changing corporate culture would be much more difficult. I'm not at all in favor of an aggressive move to slow down globalization, because I think that would really hurt a lot of people around the world who are much poorer than even those at the low end of the distribution here in the United States. I'm also not in favor of reducing immigration for the same reason.
Now, during the 2016 campaign, President Trump advocated large infrastructure projects. Yet curiously, when he became president, really the first thing he pushed for was taking away people's health care. Don't you think he missed a significant opportunity? He could have started with infrastructure and it would have had a quite different political effect.
Yeah, that was actually the one and only thing that I thought he might actually pursue and possibly get done that would be helpful rather than harmful.
Right.
But it seems to have fallen by the wayside. I think it'll come up again before the 2018 elections. I don't know. But yes, I completely agree.
Now, it seems that there are a lot of programs that one could do in terms of infrastructure, such as high-speed rail, that could put a lot of people to work and provide a lot of good jobs at good wages, things that would really enable the U.S. economy to advance. Do you think at some point Trump will actually do this, or is that really something that will end up being done by a future Democratic administration?
Yeah, I've completely given up on trying to predict what Donald Trump might do.
As have we all, yeah. Okay.
But I do think it would be a good thing to do. And if it doesn't happen before 2018, it should be very high on the list of Democrats who are running and others.
Agreed.
Great.
Agreed.
Did you have something else?
There's just one more thing, referring back to Harrington. Michael Harrington said that when the labor movement acts politically through the Democratic Party, it provides a kind of rough equivalent to having a social democratic party, not what people had in Europe, but a kind of rough equivalent. Do you think that analysis was an accurate one?
Well, I waffle on this, and I think the historical record, at least my reading of it, suggests reason for a bit of ambivalence. Most of the time, I think I agree with that, but we do have this, several things that make our situation different here. One is the very prominent role of private money in electoral politics, and also the role of lobbying in between elections in the United States, which really separates us from most other rich democratic countries and makes it that much harder for, even if the union movement were stronger, would make it harder for it to get its voice heard. But nonetheless, I do think that's historically been a really important part of advancing progressive legislation in the United States, and I hope that it might continue to be the case. You know, it certainly was critical for the $15 minimum wage here in California. Had it not been for and for other things that are going on now, the nurses union is really strongly pushing this consideration of single-payer health care. Again, I don't know how that's going to play out, but I certainly think putting it on the table has been a beneficial thing.
Okay, great. And now I want to bring in Eldon Klingon, who is one of our great members. He's in Massachusetts, and I just can't think, I mean, there isn't anybody amongst us who's a more enthusiastic and committed activist than he is. And he's also extremely well read and a good studier. And so whatever Eldon has to say, I'm sure we will all benefit from greatly. And I'm sure he's got questions to ask of you. So, Eldon, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. The floor or the stage is yours.
Patty, were you going to ask me a question?
No, I wondered if you wanted to ask our speaker anything.
No, just to say to him that I bought his book when it came out and have enjoyed it. I don't agree with everything in it, but I don't agree with everything in any book. So I think he's made a real contribution, and I'm honored to be sharing even a remote platform with him.
Okay, well, basically, we want to know what your thoughts and commentary are on this subject.
Patty?
Yes.
Say again, please.
Okay, Okay, we want to know what your commentary is on the subject of social democracy for America,
Okay.
and especially the question of the Democratic Party as relates to these issues.
Okay. Well, I have to speak from the perspective of a grassroots activist rather than a person who deals necessarily in the formulation of theories. And at least as far as the state with which I have experience, which is Massachusetts, I would say that social democratic ideas are growing rapidly.
Mm.
This is not to say that the social democratic, a formal social democratic movement is growing, but a movement that is in fact social democratic is developing, I think, not only in this state, but developing throughout the United States. A significant part of this was Bernie Sanders' campaign, where he tapped into what really amounted to the base for social democratic reform that is a historic part of the Democratic Party. And we're seeing, in addition to a great deal of anti-Trump feeling, of course, we're seeing the results of that on local levels here. We have just 2 months ago, approximately, we had our state convention in the Democratic Party, and I would certainly characterize that platform as a social democratic platform. Not everything in it, not everything in Professor Kenworthy's book is included in that platform, but a great deal is. The problem always in Massachusetts is not what the party activists, as represented in convention, believe. The problem is with our state legislature, which is considerably more conservative than the activists of the party, certainly. And what will happen in terms of our achievement of substantial goals depends very much on our ability to bring influence on members of the legislature and on our ability to elect progressive members of the legislature in the future. The connection between those two things is simply organization. And this has been the missing element in the past, in my experience in the Democratic Party in this state. Essentially, we had always an activist convention, and we had a more conservative state leadership, more conservative legislature. There is a difference this year, and that difference is a developing organization within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. This has not, in a formal sense, really occurred and been successful in the past. There have been progressive organizations. They've, to a considerable extent, oriented toward the Democratic Party, but they have not been successful in terms of their numbers. That has changed. We had, for example, and I had a great deal of participation in this effort, so I'm familiar with it. We had elected approximately a quarter of the delegates to the last Democratic State Convention from organized progressive groups. Now, great many other progressives were not a part, of course, of that whole effort because they were not significantly involved in the organizations that were conducting it. But nevertheless, we were able to do something which has not been done at Democratic conventions, at least in a long time, in this state, and that is to organize around a platform and to elect delegates who would caucus together in effect and see to it that this platform happened. Our task at this point is essentially one of influence on the existing members of the state legislature, and I have a good deal of confidence at this point in our ability to do this if we are able to organize properly, and that is, of course, always the great if in dealing with left and progressive movements in this country. So far, and I'll take my own little town here. We have been able, first of all, to put together an activist group, and with the three little towns together that are nearby each other here, we have been able to build a group of activists who are able to put pressure on these members of the legislature. We are getting better at that. We are coordinating with people in other towns who are within, for example, our state senatorial district. Our ability, therefore, to put pressure both on members of our state House representatives and on our state senatorial district representatives is considerably greater. We have, as I say, we are coordinating these efforts, and I'll tell you a story. Our state senator, of course, has a small staff, and one of the people in that staff was overheard to say, we're getting nothing but phone calls. We've never had anything like this before. How long is this going to continue? And our answer is, get used to it. Yeah. This is the new normal. Yeah. We're going to stay in touch with you, and we're going to watch what you're doing, and we're going to express ourselves accordingly. This is a new development within this state. This organizational ability. Now, how long will it last? Well, I think that we've got a permanent situation here, although I think the farther left portions of our coalition, the people who were in the Bernie movement, basically, I think that they are likely to find themselves in very deep water shortly. And I look at the Convention of Democratic Socialists of America that is just concluded, and I say to myself, DSA has managed within a period of about a year to do what it took Students for a Democratic Society to do 8 years, which is essentially reach a point of, I think, ideological irrelevance to most of the country. Now, some of those folks will probably drift off, maybe a fair number of them. A number of them have already been pushing for third-party campaigns in 2020. These are individuals, and I have to be blunt here. The Bernie movement in the state has allowed itself to be infiltrated fairly heavily by a Trotskyist group, and that group is using the Bernie movement to promote its own political ambitions, and I think the result has to be, in the end, that of us, however, who are concentrated on the Democratic Party and who are concentrated on a social democratic platform are not going to have that happen to us. And we're looking forward, for example, to a $15 minimum wage. Again, as Professor Kenworthy said, this is something that is done over a period of years, but I think we're going to pass it in this legislative session. If we don't get it passed, we're going to pass it by a referendum ballot. So one way or the other, I think we're going to get this done. And similarly, we are moving with a tax revision. This is extremely difficult in Massachusetts because we have, of all things, a state income tax that is a flat tax. Progressive state, and it has a flat income tax.
Wow.
So we're moving with constitutional amendment to get around that somewhat. Again, this is something I think that will be on the ballot in 2018 and will be successful. But from a point of view of platform, of organization, and of the ability to bring pressure to bear on our political machinery, I think we're moving ahead, and I'm really very happy about the kind of development that we've had.
Well, that says a lot. You being happy about it is a big deal.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
I have a question I want to ask.
Okay. We're being told that we only have about 10 minutes left, if that, and that there are people yearning to ask questions from the floor. So with that, we're going to open it up, and our first question will be from Rick DeLoss.
So I think we have to ask the three here. So my question is to all of the panelists. We're hearing a lot about political action, legislative action in the states. And mostly that is because we have a fairly dysfunctional federal government where the Senate is in fact somewhat gerrymandered in the fact that just the population distribution in America today has moved to the coast, and yet we have 2 senators for each state, and we're not going to be able to fix that anytime soon.
Ever.
So is this the model that these things are going to be implemented at a state or even a local city level, like minimum wage and CTAC? And do we think that's a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, earlier in the program, we had some folks on from Hungary and Bulgaria who were saying that they're part of the EU, but they're getting left out of the prosperity part of the equation because they're getting used as a low-wage place for manufacturing, with the profits going to the wealthier European countries. So what does that look like in America if each of the states does its own thing and the federal government doesn't, and we end up with states like Mississippi or Louisiana falling into those can't-be-helped categories? So that's not for any particular person, but I don't know who wants to speak to that.
I think we are probably stuck with having 2 senators from each state. Germany does have an upper house that has a population range under which each of the federal states there gets 3, 4, or 5 representatives in the upper house, but I can't see that changing here. I think it would take really getting a Democratic majority back in the Senate for a number of things to happen again. And in the meantime, I'm afraid we are left with a lot of action at a state-by-state level. We have to recognize, though, that when things are done state by state, there'll be wide variations. New York and Mississippi are simply not going to pass the same things.
Patty, could I chime in?
Please.
I think first of all there's the practical consideration that you do what you can, when you can, where you can, and this is at the moment, this is on a state level. We are basically riding a large part of the movement that began with Bernie Sanders last year, who, by the way, is a social democrat. He's not a socialist. He calls himself a socialist, but he's just trying to get back to his Yipsel past. The other part about it is some sense of what our principal political task at the moment is, and as far as I'm concerned, that is to make clear to the working class of this country where, in fact, their interests lie. And this is part of the reason why we lost the last election and why we have lost a number of elections in the past. A bulk of people, or a large number of people who should have been voting Democratic for a number of reasons have voted Republican and have obviously hurt themselves considerably. But nevertheless, we need to raise banners showing people what we would do if we, in fact, control the federal government. And the way we can do that is in the states where we have substantial influence, like California is the best example, but states like Massachusetts as well. We have to show them programs that, in fact, would help them to lead better lives. And this is essentially the essence of social democracy as far as I'm concerned. And we can do that by things like increasing the minimum wage. We can do that by things like having, in my state, I know California has this, a sick and family leave program. I think we're going to do both of those things, but beyond that point, we might even get into a Medicare for all program on a state level, and if we can't pass it, we at least, by advocating it and by presenting it in our legislatures, we can make people sense that we're on their side. I always tell the story about when I was a small boy. The first thing about politics I ever learned was that Franklin Roosevelt was on my side. And that was a conviction that was very firmly held throughout working class America in the early 40s. And I can, we need to have the majority of Americans come to feel that again, that the Democratic Party is the place that their needs will be taken care of, and their proper desire to have better lives for themselves and their children will be met in that party. So, we work on the state level. Hopefully we're gonna do something in 2018 in terms of the Congress, and then of course we'll have the job of 2020. But we have to organize, and we organize around issues. We make clear where our sympathies are, and hope we'll get the proper response.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Kenworthy, did you have a final comment you'd like to give us?
Oh, I fully agree with everything that was just said, and I'll just add one minor addition, which is that about half or more of the population of the country lives in bluish states where some of this stuff is within reach, and so why not make their lives better instead of just waiting around for progress at the federal level?
Perfectly said. That was great. And I just wanted to give everybody a kind of image to take away. If you take the map of the United States and you kind of square corners and stuff, you can come up with basically a rectangle. And if you take that rectangle and you take the sides, north, south, east, west, never mind south, but you know, there's a little bit of it that can get in here. You end up with not only population centers, but blue states, or at least purple state, blue and purple states on the exterior, and on the inside you have red to purple states. And you can see, you can watch our population movements over the last 10 years, and you'll see, as Rick pointed out, more and more of our people, certainly progressives, are moving into cities and the blue states. And unfortunately, in many ways, what that does is to dilute progressives' power. And I would like to just put out an idea for the Democratic Party. If we're going to get serious about organizing and taking over taking back the Congress in 2018, and even more so if we're going to take back the White House in 2020, I really think that we have to start thinking about moving our young people anyway, and perhaps our retirees who might be willing to move to a different place if they've got their principles in hand. We need to move organizers from the blue states into the red states. And we need people to actually make at least a 2-year commitment to move into these states and organize for the Democratic Party and for our labor and progressive issues. We've got a terrible situation developing in Ohio, for instance, where Sherrod Brown may not be able to keep his seat. And that would be such a tragedy. I mean, the thought of that makes me cry. And if only we had a couple thousand enthusiastic volunteers, quotes, because I think the Democrats have to pay for this. You know, this is crazy trying to do everything on the cheap. It's about time the Democratic Party made a commitment to winning. And what we need to do that is to move 1,000 young quote-unquote volunteers, 1,000 older retirees into Cleveland, into the Cincinnati area, into I don't know, other parts of Ohio that we can think of, and start working for Sherrod Brown. And frankly, I think we needed to do this 6 months ago, but I am dedicated to moving this idea to make it happen at least in another, in another 6 months. Another thing we need to do is have people move into and work for the elections or the campaigns, first in New Jersey and then in Virginia. Those are both happening in 2017, and people aren't even thinking about that. So the only other thing I would say is wherever you are, pay attention and organize, organize, organize.
Well, I want to thank all of our speakers here today. Joe Ryan, a longtime member of the Social Democrats, and we have the benefit in our organization of folks that have been involved for decades, and we, like Eldon, for crying out loud, what a history he has. Yeah. So we're definitely rich in that regard. Thank you, Lane Kenworthy, for joining us from California. I appreciate your expertise and your commentary today.
And your heart.
And wanted to give you a couple closing comments here. Number one, this program we did today is paid for entirely by the members of Social Democrats USA. So your dues do make this happen. So if you're thinking your dues are going into some bucket somewhere, they're not. They're paying for things like this that we do and we feel are very valuable. And we hope you feel they're valuable too, and you'll continue to support them. During the program today, there was an event in Charlottesville, Virginia, which distracted a lot of our viewers. There was a rally of Klansmen and neo-Nazis that turned violent and caused the police to intervene and for the governor to declare a state of emergency. So for those of you that were distracted by this story, we want you to know that the video of this program will be on our website as soon as we get it edited and put together. It'll be on the site for you to watch whenever you like, and it will stay there for archive purposes into the future. So thank everybody for participating. Thank you everyone, and those who flew in like Patty and came into town, Jason and Michael, for this event. We thank them, and we thank again Hans and Virginia Gruner for hosting us in this facility, which has always been very, very good for us.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
thank you everyone. And that's it. We'll see you again next time.